Facing d4 usually means boring positional chess, but not today. Today we're going to use a juicy, aggressive gambit called the Budapest Gambit, and I'll show you my 10 favorite traps that allow you to crush white when they play most natural opening moves, and often they get crushed before they even comprehend what is going on here. For example, in this position, while the main move for white is knight to f3, and we will talk about that, it's also very natural for white to try to do something against this provocative knight in the middle of the board. And what if your opponent goes pawn to f3? Well, we shouldn't judge white for doing so. Even Magnus Carlsen started as Magnus Blunderson. And your opponent expects this knight to move, however, you come up with an unpleasant surprise, bishop b4 check. Now, since your knight from here controls these two squares, it's actually not that simple for white to cover, but still they do. Bishop d2 is more or less forced, and then again your opponent thinks you're going to trade right there, but you play another unexpected check, queen to h4, g3 is forced, and now you sacrifice your knight. And at this point, just be careful, do not bite into this high-calorie rook, instead take this light snack, and the game is over. Let me also show you another variation which made me really believe in the Budapest Gambit back in the day. If white goes bishop f4, which looks like a perfectly natural move which develops a piece and guards this additional pawn just in case, black continues with bishop b4, check once again. Since the knight covers this square, the knight cannot go there, black will simply capture it twice, therefore knight to d2 is forced, and now black goes pawn to d6, and that is a classical Igor Nation stuff. Good things come to those who bait. Who would have thought that this move pawn takes d6 is a losing blunder, it's a decisive error of white. But it's really crazy to even think about that, because that is what most of your opponents will certainly do. And it is losing because black's got this move queen to f6, which attacks the bishop. Now the bishop is also overloaded as it has to guard the knight on d2. It cannot easily walk away. Plus, if the bishop moves away somewhere, then this pawn on f2 falls. Therefore, there are a lot of issues that white faces here. Notice that the knight is pinned, therefore this knight can't go away. And what to do about this? If they go e3, the move which seems to make sense at first, the bishop no longer guards the knight, and that fails to bishop d2 check, and you win the game. It forces the king to move, you're up a piece, you continue attacking, so that is absolutely bad. And if otherwise white plays whatever move to defend the bishop, to play g3 or bishop e3, whatever, then you just take on d2 first, which allows you to distract the bishop, and once the bishop is distracted, this is a checkmate. Alright, now let's move on to the main line. While Stockfish is disgusted by gambits usually, and it may seem like it's just enough for white to simply develop somehow and they will end up with an extra pawn while avoiding all your cheap tricks. It's actually not that simple, because what I recommend you to do is to simply play for that long-term compensation, a long-term attack. Let's say your opponent does everything fine. What you're going to do here is just to play something like bishop f5, queen e7, castle queenside, put your rook to this open file, and while your opponent has that extra pawn, that pawn on e3, it doesn't really matter at the moment. This pawn rather blocks the bishop development, and this pawn might matter 30 moves later in an endgame. But right now, your opponent needs to survive your attack, which is not easy at all. For example, at this point, the most played move bishop d3 is yet another unhappy turn to a blunderville for white, because instead of bishop f5 or something like that, you've got an even stronger move, which is bishop b4 check, which ruins coordination of white's pieces. And you can notice that it's a very common attacking group, having this knight on e4 controlling these two squares, and your bishop also shooting across the same diagonal, which makes it uncomfortable for white to cover. Because of this bishop check, the knight cannot go here. Again, in this case, you're just gonna trade off 2 times and then win some material. And instead, if your opponent tries to cover by going bishop d2 or knight to d2, in this case, that would block the defense of the other one, and you can happily go ahead and grab it. Notice that this bishop on b4 is protected, you keep attacking, also it cuts off the king, therefore the king can no longer castle, and you've got a winning attack here, an extra piece. Instead, if your opponent finally tries to just move the king away, then alright, white avoids an instant disaster, but in general, it's pretty hard for white to play with this centralized king, and you keep putting pressure with this knight, maybe with the bishop from g4. What can white do now? Well, it may seem tempting to attack this bishop, and maybe even white is dreaming about playing b4 if your bishop moves, but you've got another unpleasant surprise. We've got plenty of them in the Budapest Gambit. Bishop e6, which looks like you just pre-moved it, or for some reason you just blundered this bishop right here, because why not to capture it? Well, after knight takes b4, you now start pressuring this bishop on d3. And the way your knights coordinate is quite cool. Now, your knight wants to capture the bishop, but if the bishop moves, now this pawn on c4 is no longer defending, and that is why we put our bishop right here. Now bishop takes c4 comes with a check. Your queen controls this file, therefore the king is limited down to just one square, but now you keep horsing around. Knight d3 is another check. White can trade off the bishop, but it doesn't change the situation. They still have to face this check. And now once the king moves anywhere, here, doesn't really matter. You've got this discovered check. Pretty cool, right? But it's not just an attack of the king, because also his queen is hanging. Therefore, white needs to move the king in such a way where it would support the queen. But at this point, your wild pony jumps in and kicks the king right into the evaluation bar. So far we talked about your knight coming to the middle of the board, but you also have another alternative which is also pretty cool, knight to g4. It makes sense as you attack this weak pawn in the center right away, and if white goes knight f3 to develop a knight and to guard it, there is pawn to d6, attacking this pawn for the second time, and once the trade is there, there is a super common trap here. Of course, I'll tell you what to do if white doesn't fall for this trap, but anyway, it's worth noticing that if white feels annoyed by this knight and tries to chase it away, there is sort of a Tennyson Gambit trap with reversed color. You can sacrifice the knight right here, pretty impressive, and then continue with this check, which is also a discovered attack of the queen, and therefore you're about to grab the queen. Now the king is exposed, the queen keeps attacking, and you've got a winning position. What if your opponent does not fall for the trap and just plays a normal development move? No problem, we're going to aim for that long-term compensation. You develop a knight, and then if your opponent attacks the knight at this point, just be careful that sacrifice no longer works, because in this line, if you try to play it out, the issue here is that the queen on d1 is protected, therefore you cannot win it. That's the issue, so don't go there. In this case, we do not sacrifice the knight. You just drop it back to e5. From here, you also put pressure to this central pawn on c4, and in general, you have a nice centralized knight, again, potentially putting pressure right here, even though you need to be careful with this potential counter trick. And after e3, you castle, white goes bishop e2, white feels like they successfully avoided all the tricks that you had, but not yet. We're going to play queen to g5, taking aim at this pawn. And yes, white can play something like g3, weakening his king side or king f1, and then they're not losing right away, but you have that long-term compensation. The king got stuck, the king side is weak, and you're going to develop. Of course, maybe avoid this move first, but after that, just develop, lay rook d8, and you've got a great position. But of course, it is very tempting for white to not overthink it and to follow the ancient Sun Tzu quote, I don't know, I'm just going to castle. If he does that, then bishop takes h3 is another thing that your opponent blunder. You are taking advantage of the pin. Because of the pin, the pawn cannot take it. If the pawn moves, it's going to drop the rook right here, and in any case, you're having a winning attack. One of the attempts to refute this gambit for white is to play the move pawn to e4. Where white does not hold on to this extra pawn, they're ready to give it back, but their idea is that now the queen hits this knight. Therefore, it seems like knight takes e5 is forced, but then pawn to f4 kicks the knight back. Again, the knight can no longer go forward because of the queen. This pawn on c4 is also protected. Now white's got these strong pawns in the middle of the board. White is grabbing space, pushing your knight somewhere back, and that's what white is hoping for. However, once again, instead of going in that direction, we've got to move pawn to d6. Similar to all the other variations which we discussed so far, you're trying to capitalize on quick development and attack. From here also it opens up the bishop, therefore it guards the knight, and therefore white can no longer capture it. Plus you keep attacking this pawn, and once the exchange is made, now you also developed your bishop with a tempo, and you're actually also hitting this pawn on h2. There are also some nice traps right here as well. If white pushes the pawn forward, in this case you've got this really cool move which wins the game. It threatens queen f2, checkmate. The pawn cannot take the knight because it's pinned, and otherwise white needs to counter the checkmate threat. And if he does it by moving the queen here or here, it does not even matter. Do you see the winning shot for black? I'll give you a couple of seconds to find it by yourself. It is knight takes f2. A nice little combo. You attack the rook, attack the king, but if the knight is captured, there's bishop to g3. Really nice skewer where you win the queen and you keep attacking, you end up with a totally winning position. By the way, if you want to know how to find those tactical shots, not only in tactical drills, but also in your actual blitz games, I've got a free masterclass about that. I'll drop a link down below. You can check it out later. There is another sub-variation of the same trap here. If white wants to be rock solid and he tries to play g3 to totally obstruct your bishop along this diagonal, then you still can sacrifice your knight, surprisingly, on f2, with a similar tennis and gambit trap idea. Now, after the knight is accepted, bishop takes g3, opens up this discovered attack, and at first it seems like that idea fails here, because the king can, instead of taking the bishop, can jump right here and protect the queen. Therefore, the queen is not lost. Does it mean that you miscalculated something? No, because you've got bishop g4, and that move overpowers white and wins the game. They can temporarily block, but after the trade, it gets into the same thing. King has to go out, and now queen takes d1, wins the game. Needless to say that there is a very easy way for white to avoid all the traps. They can resign immediately, and knight f3 just adds one more chapter to the story of 50 Shades of Blunders. Here, bishop b4 wins the game for black once again. The idea is, with a tempo, you open up the d-file, and once white covers the king somehow, let's say with a knight, then you wish to take on d1, forcing the king to move, and now knight will be able to take on f2 with a fork to the king and rook. There is a little bit of visualization that we need to make right here. Bishop d2 is the most natural way for white to block the check, but then your bishop slides back to c5 with a double attack to this pawn on f2. You wish to either capture with the bishop and start hitting the king, or capture with the knight with the forks to the queen and rook. Either way, it's winning for black, and if white tries to cover that way, then after the trade you actually get to the main idea just after trading off the bishops first, and then knight to f2 still wins the game. There is also a nice trap that you can set along the way. Here, if white develops knight and guards the pawn, you attack it again, they defend it again, now you develop a bishop with a check, they develop the knight to d2, trying to keep everything really nice, tight, and defend it. You go queen e7, adding the third attacker to the central pawn. Now there is no way for white to defend this pawn anymore, therefore you will definitely capture it on the next turn, and if they try to get rid of your bishop, then you capture the pawn, which looks like a blunder at first, but it's even worse than a blunder, it's a nightmare. If your opponent knows that you're a subscriber of this channel, he's terrified, he wants to avoid all the traps, and he declines the gambit. After that, he tries to play solidly, just play standard classical opening moves, then there is still a famous quote of Magnus Tyson about that. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the f-pawn. And it's true in this position just as well. White is defenseless, you're winning once again. If white tries to confuse you by counterattacking your queen, then you have a counterattack to their counterattack, which is bishop takes f2. And since your attack is stronger, the king has to move, and now white is destroyed. For example, if the bishop returns, then you end up with this nice fork. Then your opponent thinks, okay, if that's the case, I'm gonna tame this tricky pony once and for all. But your horse does not want to obey and wins the game. Since his previous defense failed, this time white wants to stop your knight from jumping forward, and he goes pawn to h3. In this case, you sacrifice the bishop and then continue an attack. After that, your queen comes forward and finishes the game. But there is good news for white here actually. He's almost ready for the next game. While it may be difficult to remember all these traps, there is a single, universal, very simple rule that levels up your chess right away. Check this out in this video. And if you want your opponents to really start hating you, check out this free masterclass.